This old house is made possible by a grant from Owens Corning Fiberglass Corporation, manufacturers of residential building products.
Hi, I'm Bob Vila. Welcome to this old house. I'm up in the attic, saving myself a bundle this week. You know, when we talked with our energy auditor a couple of weeks ago, one of the main things that he told us was that when you start thinking about insulating, the main place to go is the attic. Never mind the sidewalls and the windows at first, because most of your heat is going to be lost through that attic space. So what I'm doing today is installing 9-inch fiberglass insulation in the spaces between the ceiling rafters. And if you'll notice, all of this stuff always has a foil or paper backing, and you always want to make sure that that is facing towards the heated part of the house. In this case, I'm somewhere over my kitchen area. And it's important that you do that because this is what prevents all the warm, moist air that's in your heated area from rising into the attic, being lost, and more than that, affecting the insulation by making it moist, which will compact it eventually. Another thing that I've been doing is, since I've got a full 9 inches, which give me an R30 value, I've been hanging it over on top of my roof rafters, because they're also a source of heat loss up to a certain point. I'm almost done, actually. I've only got a small area left, and I want to show you the one problem area in the attic space. It's really an easy job because it's just a deck that I have to fill in the cavities in, except right here in front of me, where the attic opening is. I don't have a staircase leading to this attic. All I've got is a folding set of stairs. And if you think about it, there's hardly a way to insulate them because once they're folded up and closed, you'd have to stick insulation in the middle of them or somehow. You don't want to do that. What we'll be doing is hinging a piece of plywood to act as a trap door almost right on top of these stairs. And then all we have to do is staple some insulation onto that, and we'll end up with a fully insulated attic. Now, let's get started talking about what we're going to be showing you today. We're going to get around to talking with Norman, who we didn't have time for last week. He's downstairs building an archway that we've designed to separate the new entryway from our new dining room. So we'll get to that. We're also going to be giving you a couple more tips on sheetrock hanging and how to finish sheetrock. And we'll be spending quite a bit of time in the kitchen talking about the cabinet faces. You know, we're building our own kitchen cabinets. And towards the end of the show, we'll be taking a field trip to a wood stove shop, and hopefully we'll be picking a wood stove for our living room. Let's get started down in the kitchen. Last time we were in the kitchen, last week, we were talking about how we started off building our kitchen cabinets by building the bases out of 2x4 stock and installing them in place. And remember, I stressed that they had to be perfectly level. The next thing we did was to put down our plywood deck, and that's all been screwed in place. And after that, we got involved in putting up the vertical pieces, the partitions as we're referring to them, which define the end of a cabinet or box and different elements within the kitchen. What I've got right here is a bank of drawers. There'll be 3 storage drawers there, and so I've got 2 vertical panels in between it. You might notice that what I've been using to build these cabinet faces, these front panels, is soft pine. The reason we're just using a wood like that is that it's easy to work with, and in any case, it'll be covered with a plastic laminate material. Let's talk a little bit about how we actually do this, because we don't build this in place. So you can see from the one that's propped up against the wall here, it's basically just a frame. And we built it in what's going to be the living room, where I've borrowed a nice table saw, and I've got a very good setup going over there. These will be installed like so. And then they will be taking the doors and the drawer fronts and so forth. Let's actually talk a little bit about that, because there's 2 things involved. One of them is designing it, and here's a little bit of a mock-up. We haven't finished this piece yet. And we have to deal with horizontals or rails and verticals or stiles. And what we've done is that we decided we wanted to start off at the top with rather a thick 3 1/4 inch rail, just to have that extra mass. It's not so much for structural strength, it's just for eye appeal. Because remember, on top of this, we'll be setting down our countertop. Then as we go down, our middle rail is reduced down to about 2 1/4 inches. And this already is defining the space where the drawers would fit, the line of drawers along the top. And then, as you keep on going down, the bottom rail is just shy of 2 inches, and of course installed or built so that it'll be flush with this floor. Once we had determined that, then we've got to figure out how to build the actual front face that's going to go on this particular box. And there's really two dimensions to start off with, the width and the height. Now, if you recall, in this layout, over here to the left of this unit is where I'm installing the dishwasher. So I don't need any kind of a face over this, because obviously the dishwasher front will be all you see. The only thing that connects this partition with this one will be the countertop once we put that in place. So what I needed to get here was a width for this front face from this panel here to back over here, the back side of this stile. Because what I want to do is, when it's finished, to butt the two pieces together so that I can join them there. And the next dimension, of course, is just measured from the top of the top rail to the bottom of the bottom rail. And this has to be perfectly square. So obviously, all of these vertical dimensions are going to be same, and the horizontal dimensions will all be the same. The interesting thing you might question is, how do you put them together? How do you join them? And we've been using something that's a very simple joint. It's a half lap joint. And basically, you take away half of the stock on one piece of the wood, and you remove half of the stock from the other piece of wood so that the two fit over each other. Now, if that looks like a mysterious thing to do, believe me, it isn't. Why don't we go over to the living room where my little table saw is set up, and I'll show you how we do it. You know, our entire woodworking shop here at this old house consists of one table saw. If you ask me, that's the most important tool to have in a wood shop. And this is a good one. We've borrowed it. It's a contractor's model, a professional kind of tool that you'd find in a cabinet shop. And it would go for several $100s, but we were lucky enough to get it on loan for a few days. I guess the main difference in an expensive one like this is the fact that it's very precision milled steel. The base is very sturdy. The fences, these two items that I'm putting my hands on, are very, very accurate. And this, of course, is what's called a ripping fence. And you put your stock up against it in order to rip straight across it. And this is a crosscut fence, which actually can be moved in either direction so that you can get crosscuts on it, miter cuts on it. And the blade, needless to say, is the most important aspect of the whole saw. We have a carbide tip blade, which is about a $40 item. And believe me, it'll outlive probably 4 or 5 inexpensive blades, and that's why we went ahead and got one of those. This is what's called a planer blade, which assures us of getting very smooth cuts in our stock. And after all, we're building kitchen cabinets, so we want to be pretty precise. And that's the fun of it, being able to be precise, as opposed to just doing rough carpentry. Now, getting over to the discussion of the lap joint that we're going to use throughout these kitchen cabinets, as you'll recall, I was saying that what we want to do is remove exactly half of the stock from the piece of wood, so that it'll join with the other one. And the way to do this here, for our purposes, is just to use that blade to dig away and excavate all of that wood. In a professional woodworking shop, you could have a dado cutter, a number of different attachments that can just in one cross, once through the blade, remove all of that wood. In any case, the first thing that you have to do is figure out the height of that blade so that it's exactly halfway up the piece of wood. And what I did was I spent about 5 minutes setting it, because rather than measuring or doing anything like that, it's easier just to make a couple of cuts until you've got it just at the halfway point. Let me show you. A minute to put my goggles on. Make one cut across, flip the stock over, line it up, make a second cut, and as you'll see by that line right there, I'm getting rid of half of the stock. So the next thing I have to determine is how far back to go. And that, of course, is dependent on the width of the other piece of wood that's being joined to this one. So if I were removing, say, 2.5 inches, I would have to make a mark on this wood exactly that thickness. The easy way to do it is to use this ripping fence that I was talking about a minute ago, and line it up using the piece of stock that will be joined. And the most important consideration when you're doing this is to remember to include the thickness of the blade within this dimension, because the most common mistake in woodwork is to forget about the thickness of that blade, and then you're usually off almost 1/8 of an inch in all your cuts. So once I've established that, as close as I can get it, I want to freeze this fence, get my goggles back on, and then just make a series of cuts. Just almost like a meat slicer, because this is a softwood that we're using. If I were working in a wood shop, they'd probably fire me for doing it this way, but I've got time. If I do this to it, run it along the top of the blade, I can kind of dress it out so that it's relatively smooth. Now there I have half of my joint. And if I'm lucky, the two of them will fit together rather nicely, as these do. The next thing I want to do is join the two together, and the glue is the most important factor. This is a good carpenter's glue, and it'll do most of the holding involved. And this often happens. The top of the bottle gets a little bit clogged up. Most of the holding that goes on here is done by the glue, but in addition, I'm going to secure it by putting a couple of screws in it. And I'll drill a starter hole. This old drill gun actually is fitted right now with what's called a countersink, which is a drill bit, and let me show you what it actually does. You want to keep that hole far away from the edge of the wood so that you don't split it. Drills a pilot hole, and then it makes a big enough diameter hole so that the head of the screw will actually be flush with the wood. These are 5/8 inch screws that we're using, and they're number 8 in thickness. The thickness of the shaft of the screw is determined by a series of numbers, and the lower the number, the thinner that shaft is. Of course, if you're doing 20 or 30 of these, you're going to set yourself up for a little bit of an assembly line so that you make all your cuts and get all your joints ready to go before you start driving screws and gluing the pieces together. But that's essentially it. That's essentially how they're put together. And now why don't we go back in the kitchen for a minute, and I'll show you how we attach one of those cabinet fronts to the actual boxes. Okay, well, this step is relatively easy. It's just a question of joining this that we've made with the box that we've already made. And one of the things that you want to do before you do anything that's permanent is to make sure that the pieces are going to fit together well. And in this case, I'm just going to set it up here and see how it looks. That's level. That'll be flush with my floor, which is one of the most important things. And then along the side, once I put the two together, they'll be just fine. So let's use some more of that glue that we were just talking about, because the best bond that you can possibly hope for involves putting a good bead of carpenter's glue along the edges that you're joining. And if you drip a little, it's not the end of the world. You can always clean it up with a rag. We're not doing finish work yet, so we don't have to worry about being extremely careful. There. There. You could also take a brush and brush your glue on. A lot of old-timers like to do that. But anyway, we're aiming for speed here. I've made myself a shim here just to hold things in place for myself. It's not perfect because the floor is not perfectly flat. And I am going to drive a nail right now, 6-penny finish nail, through here, just to help the glue along, making sure that I'm perfectly flush with my plywood deck. And although this pine is going to be covered in a plastic laminate, I don't want to dent the pine, because then I might have that plastic buckle in and crack. So I'll take the nail set and make sure that nail goes in, about 1/8 of an inch farther below the surface of the wood. Then, let's put another one right here, making sure that this edge of the pine and the plywood side are perfectly flush. Just within a hair of driving the nail through. There. And I think the third nail will go at this joint, where this face and this one come together. Again, making sure that the pieces are coming together square and even. And there I'll just give it a bang because I don't care what happens on the inside. I'm not going to laminate that. Okay, so that starts to give you an idea of what they're actually going to look like. The next step involves building the drawers and the doors, and we'll get to that next week. And hopefully we'll have time to start talking about how we laminate these with the plastic material. Right now, let's go talk a little bit more about sheetrock applications. We've been doing a good deal of sheetrock work around the walls here that separate our new bathroom from our master bedroom. And if you recall last week, I began with this wall here at the end of the hallway and showed you how to get the paper tape on the joint between the two sheets and put on the first coat of this joint compound, which comes in a bucket from the hardware store. This is, of course, the kind of job that is not my favorite, but practice does tend to make you better at it, and I haven't been practicing too much. All we have to do this time around is to add a second coat of the material to start covering up that paper tape a little bit better. And I suppose one trick is to try to go slowly and to try to do it carefully enough that you don't build up too much of this material, because remember, the more you put on, the more you'll have to sand off later. And the purpose here is to just feather it kind of over that joint so that you're covering up the tape without a great deal of buildup. And I've got to go slowly, but I also wanted to talk about all the little dimples in the sheetrock where the drywall screws were attached and driven in. And I guess what I'm talking about is right along here. We applied a little bit of material to it on the first coat, and I don't know if you can pick it up, but they all look like dimples now, because this material tends to shrink, and once it shrinks, it just recesses. So the second time around, after it's good and dry, you have to give it a second bit of a hit like that. And the second time around, it usually sets up enough. And if you don't put too much on there, you won't hardly have any work at all to do. Of course, once you start sanding this stuff, you want to make sure that you don't sand where you have the paper finish on the board, because then you've got a problem when you reach the painting stages. And that's one thing that you want to avoid. It'll end up being kind of almost a furry affair that you will have a lot of trouble putting paint on. Now, this is going to take me a while to get at, but you know, earlier today I was with a friend of mine, John Davies, who's an architect here, and he and I were looking at wood stoves and considering the right one for our living room. So I want you to take a look at that visit, and when we come back, we'll join Norman over in the dining room. He's been working on the archway that we've designed to separate the dining room from the entryway. So join us for a minute with the wood stoves, and I'll finish this up.
What do you think of this one, Bob?
It's beautiful. It's almost like a museum piece.
Well, it is. It's porcelain enamel on cast iron. It's made in Denmark.
It's a very high-quality item, I take it.
It's a beautiful stove, and it's a very efficient heater also.
In Denmark, something like this is almost one of the most important pieces of furniture in the house.
I think so, yes. That's why it's made so decoratively.
This is strictly for burning wood.
It's for burning wood. Logs go in lengthwise. They burn from front to back.
Yeah.
You control the fire with this air vent adjustment here.
Yeah.
For starting the fire, there's a bypass. It bypasses the heat exchanger module on the top of the stove.
It would really look great in our living room. How much
really
does it cost?
Well, it's about $1,200.
I think that's a little bit high for our budget. I'm sure it's worth it because it's a beautiful item.
It's a good value.
But it's just out of our price range. Let's look at some others. What have we got over here?
This also is a front-to-back burner, American-made stove.
Uh-huh.
Based originally on the traditional shaker stoves, except that it's more decorative. It's got sculptural scenes on the side of the stove.
Yeah. Well, one thing I like about it is the size of it. You can get a lot of wood in there.
You
and
can.
That is nice, these kind of forest scenes. How do they do that? That's part of the casting?
Well, that's the nature of cast iron. It's the plastic material. You pour it in a mold. You can do very decorative sculptural things with it. That's the air regulator that controls the rate of the fire.
And this carries a price tag of?
That's about $600.
Well, or maybe we're getting closer, but...
All right, let's keep going. For about half that much, about $300.
The $300
we
range.
have a very ingeniously designed, very simple stove. It's less expensive because it's cheaper to manufacture because it's a simpler design.
There's nothing to it almost.
The
I like
air
that.
controls are on top. You have the one lid in your hand.
That's the only opening part?
That's correct.
So you throw your logs in from the top.
That's right.
Now, you said this was steel?
It's steel.
Is that not as good as cast iron?
Pound for pound, they're about the same. Steel and cast iron stoves will perform
They give you the same
just about as well.
output?
Steel doesn't have the decorative qualities of iron.
But what about long life is what I was
If
getting
you
at.
overfire and abuse a stove, if you overfire a cast iron stove, you can crack a plate. If you overfire a steel stove, you can warp a piece and maybe break a weld.
So they're both about the same, and it's a question of how you use them.
Properly used and properly managed, they'll both last many, many years.
Okay, so we've come down to 300, so the next item should be 150. Does my logic hold?
We're going back up again. This is about 600, and this, interestingly, is a combination of steel and cast iron. The barrel of the stove is steel. The front, the door, the cook plates.
This is kind of a funky design. It looks like an old-time washing machine.
Well, it's a very good stove.
I like it. I may be wrong, but this looks just like a pie plate.
That is a pie plate. It's a heat-resistant glass pie plate with another piece of heat-resistant flat glass on the inside.
Yeah.
So what you have is an insulated glass door, just like an insulated glass window.
So you can see your fire going
You can see
on.
the fire without smoke condensing all over the inside of the door.
And again, you can get some enormous logs in here so that the thing could burn all night long.
Easily.
I like the look of it. I'd have to talk a couple of other people into it, but it's, what, $600 for that?
About $600. Now we're going back up again in price.
This looks more like a fireplace in a ski lodge than anything.
Well,
I'm
it
used to.
is, but it has these doors that open and close with this handle so that you can burn it as a closed stove. And the doors clamp back tightly against a gasket when it's being burned.
And when it's open, you can have a screen over it.
And when it's open, you can set the screen right up in front of it.
Yeah. How much does this one go for?
That's about $1,100.
That's, again, out of our budget. I think it might even be too big for our room.
It's about right.
Is it?
For your space,
Mm-hmm.
yeah.
What have we over here? This looks like...
Well, different again. This is an English-built stove, and it's a coal-burning design. Coal, as you know, is the traditional fuel in England. It has a glass door, again, so you can see the fire.
It gives you the impression that it could have been designed in 1850.
Well, I don't think it was, but it could have been.
Yeah.
It's a traditional design.
It seems like a really nicely built stove.
It's very well made. It's made in one of the oldest foundries in England, in Colebrookdale.
Now, this would only be for burning coal?
Well, you could burn wood as a decorative fire.
Just
but
for
the
the
firebox is small,
Yeah.
so that you couldn't get long overnight fires.
Right. Now, with most of these stoves, they're meant to be fired up and going all day long, all winter long, right?
To be
You'd
used
never-
to their maximum effect, yes, especially with a coal stove.
Yeah.
You keep it going all the time.
What's the price tag on the coal stove?
This is about $650.
So that seems reasonable, just from the weight of it and so forth. And they had to bring it all the way from England. John, I don't know. We can't decide, and I'm just going to thank you for taking the time to giving me the little tour here at the shop. And I'll let you know in the next few days what we come up with, okay?
Okay, fine.
Thank you.
Nice to see you, Bob.
Well, Norm, I'm sorry we didn't get to talk about this last week, and I hope this archway that we've designed here hasn't given you too much trouble.
Well, Bob, if you hadn't changed your mind about 35 times, I wouldn't have wasted 10 sheets of plywood.
He exaggerates.
Is this what you want?
Yeah, it's exactly what I wanted. I wanted to have a curve in this space that kind of is the break, the transition point between our new greenhouse, which is full of angles, and this old bedroom, which is now our new dining room, which has a nice flat ceiling. I think it'll provide a pleasant kind of look between the two areas. It didn't take too much trouble, did it?
No, we just took the 1/2-inch plywood and cut it to the shape that you decided on and fastened it to the framework. And then now I'm taking a series of blocks, 2x4 blocks, nailing them between the 2 layers of plywood, and I'll add more about every 12, 16 inches.
Now, I want this whole thing to be finished in plaster, though.
Right. Well, what we'll do after that is we'll put blue board on each side on the plywood, and then we'll bend a piece of blue board on those blocks, make sure it's fastened good, and then you can have it plastered.
Okay, I think I'll let Sal Vasallo do that. I'm not up to the fancy archwork yet. I guess what that meant was that because it was a double thickness, you decided to
We decided to make this wall wider. Now, will be an advantage for you because now you can take a nice big piece of oak and make a serving shelf for your dining room side.
It's an excellent idea because it's a small dining room. There's not that much room for a big sideboard, and that'll take care of that. Since this wall was indeed an afterthought, have you had a lot of trouble attaching the shoe for the stud wall?
Well, not really, but we could have made some provisions. We could have put anchor bolts here.
Yeah.
Like we did on the outside walls.
Right, stuck right into the concrete pour when we poured it, yeah. Well, you never think of everything at once, you know.
Now, most people would use masonry nails, which are made for driving into concrete, but you have to drive them perfectly straight, and if you bend them, they won't go in all the way. Now, I have a tool here that I use to drive nails into concrete, and you have to have a license to operate this tool because it shoots with 27 caliber blanks.
Gunpowder.
All right.
So you have to, yeah.
And it shoots, in this application, a nail about 2.5 inches long, especially made for this gun.
This is not a do-it-yourselfer's tool.
No, definitely not. Now, to use it, all you have to do is, it has a safety. You push it down so that it's tight to the wood. Pull the trigger. It's as simple as that.
Beautiful. Okay, well, that's one way of doing it, and you don't have to waste all that time pounding in a masonry nail.
That's right.
Norm, we're running out of time again for today. Next week, we're going to be talking about picking some ceramic tile for this masonry floor here in the greenhouse. We'll get back into our kitchen to do a little bit more work with plastic laminates and get those things farther along. And I hope to be putting up the paneling, that pine that I picked, for the living room ceiling. Until next week, I'm Bob Vila for This Old House.
This Old House is made possible by a grant from Owens Corning Fiberglass Corporation, manufacturers of residential building products.